Okay, so all set?
All set.
All right, thanks. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Nancy Rodriguez. I'm a professor in nutritional sciences at the University of Connecticut, and I wanted to welcome you to the second in a series of plant-based events, where today I'm going to be joined by Tyler Lorenzen, and we are going to have various conversations that are really specific to plant forward thinking, considering some issues that are specific to plant versus animal-based proteins, and look at what opportunities actually exist, particularly on my end, to learn certain things about the industry, to have a better understanding about where some of these different components are coming from. Before I introduce myself, I will give you a short story about, or tell you a little more about myself, I guess, is that I was at a American Society for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition meeting. It wasn't quite 5 or 6 years ago. And I was with one of my grad students and I was wandering around the exhibit hall and I came across a company called Kate's Farm. And as we were chatting, they were talking about this supplement they were providing to children who needed a special supplement that would provide them with amino acids, but these kids were not going to be able to tolerate much in the way of animal proteins and moving forward. So of course, as a protein researcher, someone who's got a big interest in essential amino acids, the branched chains, I wanted to look at it and see things. And as they talked about, well, this is a complete protein, and we got into different discussions, I was like, but where'd you get the pea protein, or where is that coming from? And that's when I first really got exposed to pea protein. And then over the years, as things evolved, and just kind of keeping track of Tyler, occasionally I told him I stalk him on certain occasions when I'm trying to learn a little bit more about what's going on with some of these plant-based products, and realized that was actually one of the earlier stages of some of the work that was going on at his family's farm, and I'm sure he'll share some of those stories with you. So we're here today because it is a very popular trend, and we have a lot to learn and a lot to share with you and perhaps provide insight, but also because I think that there is certainly a platform for those of us that are involved in agriculture and in education and in research, just to try to see where things intersect in the context of being actually beneficial, not to just our athletes or to individuals or to you, to me, but also globally. So with that, I'll tell you, I'm a West Virginia native, born and raised there. My mother, Sicilian, came over, family through Ellis Island. My father, Spanish, from Sevilla. And the interesting thing is, who would have ever thought in two small towns in West Virginia that both of these European immigrant families, my dad's dad had a grocery store and was a butcher, and so did my mother's dad. So who would have thought? I think they met, when I hear the story from one of my aunts, it was actually on the softball field somewhere in small town West Virginia. All right, but as you might guess, I grew up on spaghetti and meatballs every Sunday. And once every so often, we had our monthly consumption of liver to make sure we all had adequate vitamin A. And then as I grew up and moved along, you have to keep in mind, my father was a college athlete. He played basketball. An older brother was a quarterback at Davidson. A younger brother was a wide receiver at West Virginia. So, the story, my sister and I were dancers. So I've always had this sort of a little mix of exercise and nutrition, but I always had my mother who would tell me she couldn't understand why I spent so many years in school, because we knew how to eat, right? Mediterranean diet. There was always fruit on the table. You ate breakfast, you did lunch. So things have changed quite a bit. All right. I was at Virginia Tech for my nutrition degree, danced at Virginia Tech. I was at West Virginia for my master's and PhD. My sister and I were both dancers there, Morgantown Ballet and an Orchosis Modern company, and we kept those interests going. And then I went to Mayo Clinic. I spent 2 years there. I was a postdoc in endocrinology. My mentor used to tell me that we were nutritional physiologists. And that's when I really moved from a PhD in biochemistry and metabolism at the Ag School at West Virginia, where I literally studied lactation in dairy goats and carbohydrate and fat metabolism, all the way fast forward to protein. And while I was in Rochester, did my same balancing, taught fitness classes for a shop out of Minneapolis, and then danced. And so it was a wonderful world. And when my students say, how did you get where you are? I say, I was very lucky. And I led a charmed life. So I'm always very grateful. And, being here today reminded me of just how lucky I've been over the years. Tyler and I met some time back when I was the director of sports nutrition at the University of Connecticut. And I would say for him and a number of different athletes, it's been nice to watch folks grow and succeed, and to also learn a little bit about what they've learned as they've navigated their lives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler.
Nancy, thank you for that. That was very inspiring. Gave me chills a number of times. So, walk down memory lane real quick for the rest of you UConn folks. I'm Tyler. I played QB at UConn in 2007, 2008, and it was a special time in my life. But I'm from Iowa, and I actually transferred to UConn from a junior college in California. And thinking about the East Coast from a Midwestern's perspective, you think big city, lots of cars, etc. Density of people. And sure enough, fly over on my recruiting trip. I get off the plane. I get in the car. We're driving to stores, and I researched, but I didn't really look that in depth on exactly where it is. And first thing I see driving over the hill is cows. And I think, oh my goodness, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. This feels just like home. And sure enough, that's what UConn and stores turned into me. And I bleed blue for sure. That was home, and just fascinated. Nancy, thank you for everything you've done in my sports career and how much you helped back when I was at stores. And then of course, everyone else you have. It's truly inspiring what you've done and what the university's done. I look back on my time, I think about, if I could do it again, what would I do? And I say that because when I was a football player, that's pretty finite. I was lucky enough to go into the NFL for just a moment in time. And I like to say NFL for me stands for not for long. And then boom, I was back in the regular world. And, what could have you used at that school, from the kinesiology to nutrition to business, which is what I majored in. There's so much breadth of information and capability that UConn produces. I just hope and encourage every student athlete, but also every student really embraces all of that UConn can offer, because it's pretty impressive. And now being in the business field, I'm like, man, I should have spent more time doing that than doing football, because ultimately that's what you spend the rest of your life doing. And so speed forward, what am I doing today? In 2011, I joined my family business, and my dad is a plant breeder. He grew up in Iowa, similar to me, but really had a different approach to breeding plants. He set out to start building seeds that made more sense for food, and which was kind of odd back then. There's about 90 million acres of corn grown in the United States, around 80 million acres of soybeans, and majority of those are used to feed animals. So the taste of the seeds never really came into the equation. Ultimately, the nutrition of the seeds never was part of the equation. So he said, you know what, if we could make seeds that were just inherently more nutritious and more available, that ultimately taste better, maybe people would choose plants as their protein source. And so now it's 2020, and the plant-based industry has blown up. It's been in its nascent phase for literally a century, and now we're moving to a different time where the different forces that matter in terms of plant-based are all lining up, and where there's affordability, accessibility, but ultimately the food tastes good. And the market size is about a $5 billion market, growing at exceptional rates. During the pandemic, plant-based meat peaked at 454% growth year over year from the year before, and absolutely skyrocketing. So what Purist does is we are the connection between the farmers and the consumer brands that you buy and store, building plant-based protein similar to whey protein or soy protein, but our protein comes from peas. And that is the power behind plant-based burgers and nutrition shakes like Kate Farms, as you mentioned, Nancy, one of my favorite customers, and other things like that. And really, for me in this call, my hope is just to have a very honest conversation about where plant-based could go, why does it matter, but ultimately meet people where they're at and give folks some tools if they're interested or curious about trying a plant-based diet. What are some areas they could jump off the cliff?
Great. So the plan is, Tyler, I have a couple questions for Tyler, and I'm sure vice versa. So we're gonna have somewhat of an exchange, and we want you to participate. We want it to be engaging. And so as questions start to come in, because this 40 minutes or so, we know it's going to go quickly, but please do forward your questions, and we're going to stop so that we have enough time so that Tyler and I can do our best in trying to fill them and bridge some of the gaps. So, Tyler, one of the things that I started looking over just in thinking about, well, how can I somewhat gauge our conversations? Because I do think there's a lot of different things we could talk about and get off on tangents to a bit. But I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding that when you're talking about plant-based proteins is that, it may be that it's something that people think they need to do exclusively. And if I'm going to make a change, like I know you could talk about the changes you've made. I would say that I don't eat meatballs and spaghetti every Sunday, but I still, enjoy my red meat on occasion. I do mix things up, and there are days when I would not have an animal source of protein. I may think about where I'm going to get some other nutrients, but I guess flexitarian isn't quite the word. I would say that I blend omnivore with vegetarian and, some days, however it happens. But what is your sense? And as the industry is moving forward, do you get that question? Do people think, well, I need to go all out, or do they want to know it's okay to, bring some of these new items into their eating patterns?
Yeah, Nancy, you're hitting on a couple of things where a lot of people get super confused. What's vegan? What's vegetarian? What's omnivore? What's keto? All of these diet trends really, and most of the time the trends are a very small amount of actual people. There's some sort of blend that's ultimately happening. And so typically, and I'll maybe break it down. So pescatarian would be no meat besides fish and some dairy, but mostly plants. And then you move forward to vegetarian, eats dairy products, but no meat, and eggs, dairy and eggs, no meat. And then vegan is no meat. And vegan is really not only the diet choice, but also lifestyle. So vegan, if someone's a vegan, that means no leather shoes, none of that. And you're talking vegans and vegetarians are less than 5% of the North American population. So it's very small, growing, but small. So when you see that, when I talk about the industry's booming, it's not booming because of vegans and vegetarians. However, they're great customers. I love them, but that's not why it's booming. Why it's booming is flexitarian is probably the right world, is people that are incorporating plants into their diet more often. And frankly, I like to reframe the phrase, because I don't like to share about things I don't eat. I like to talk about the things I do eat, which I eat a lot of plants. So my diet choice and how I define myself is what I like to call is plant strongitarian. So you can do that if you want, but really getting back to your purpose, that you can eat plants and a lot of them. And if your diet is majority plant-based, that's a great way to live a long and healthy life. And it sets you up for success in terms of overall wellness and longevity. And as this panel is concerned, athletes are proving that on a plant-based diet, which majority of their calories are consumed through plants, they're able to perform at very high or even optimized levels. So that is what's exciting about today, is just the social forces that are supporting some of the reasons people are choosing to eat more plants. Because we all know eating your veggies is important no matter what type of diet you're on. And if we can have people eat a little bit more, that is helpful. So I think our goal as a company, and me as the CEO of Purus, is giving people new ways to eat that way.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, that makes, because I know that, as you know, we do talk about athletes versus children versus young adults or older adults. One of the things that I wanted to do for the audience in my introduction, but this is probably as good a time as any, is to talk about the fact that a lot of the research that I've done over the years, I've had funding from USDA or the American Heart, some subawards with NIH with colleagues in Texas, California, but the majority of funding that I've secured myself during my, hard to believe, almost 30 years at UConn, it was, you know, looking at whole proteins, eggs, dairy, beef, and really looking at these diet patterns that would come up with these essential amino acid profiles that we, you know, have associated with, you know, muscle recovery, preserving muscle, saving muscle, whatever it might be. And, you know, and kind of moving back across that, one of the studies that I did that I thought, well, of course, hindsight's always 2020, is the study I did with yogis, right? And so there isn't a lot of work on middle-aged people. I had a colleague, my first mentor, Dick Clark at UConn, tell me that my research followed my age. I started with children. I don't know if it was ever that young there, but, you know, and moved to athletes and young adults. And then I started thinking about, of course, now it's healthy aging, right? But go and rehab. How can we rehab? But with nutrition. But I did a way to improve protein intake in older men and women that were yogis by tossing on some whey, right? Powdered whey. But you and I have talked about the similarities in especially the leucine, which is a very important branch chain for the audience for muscle, between pea protein and whey protein. And so I often think about some of the products or things that I've seen, the powders and the supplements, that they almost could, you know, be used interchangeably for some of these folks that are attempting it. And with athletes, I think an advantage is that athletes can eat more calories and can, you know, get very close and usually meet their protein needs by eating more. And then we have to scale back for different people. So my big mantra has always been, you have to just fit the supplements into the overall pattern. You know, sometimes athletes don't realize how much they supplement with something. Sometimes men and women, the consumer, don't realize when they cut back from something, they don't understand that they're working at these extremes. And in total, we're really, again, trying to get everything just into that eating pattern that's going to best reflect healthy living and a long life.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of things there. And so I think the first is, you mentioned amino acids. And for you, I mean, you know all of this, but for me, understanding that your body produces some amino acids, but not all. And amino acids are an essential building block of life, that you need them. But the ones that you don't have, you have to consume through diet. And growing up as an athlete, it was the constant argument, and you spoke on whey, that if you're an athlete, you have to eat whey protein, that it was the only protein that could really work to grow muscle mass and lean muscle mass.
You had to drink milk.
Drink your milk and eat your whey. And whey protein, for those who don't know, is just a byproduct of cheese manufacturing. So as you curdle cheese and make cheese, there's a soluble or a more soluble portion of the proteins that's called whey, and then they dry it now and call it whey protein, which is a huge market. There's actually companies now that are building cheese plants purely for the whey, and which is pretty interesting. However, the amino acids part is so critical, because ultimately you need to consume the essential amino acids through your diet. And when we're looking at pea protein, it's very similar to that in form as whey protein. It's a powder. And one of our biggest customers that I can talk about publicly and will play well in the New England area, I think, is Tom Brady and his TB12 line of plant-based proteins. He has both whey protein and pea protein. And Purist helps him build his pea protein product. When you look at it, well, why does that work? Well, pea protein contains all essential amino acids. It is deficient in 2. That means it's not as high or as balanced as the other ones, which is cysteine and methionine. So what people do is formulate with just a little bit more protein, so a little bit augmentation, so you eat more grams of protein than maybe whey, or you blend with others. So we've all heard of the rice and bean pair as children. Well, rice protein contains cysteine and methionine in higher levels, so you can blend those 2 proteins together and really make a complete protein, as many people say. And I think that is part of it when you're really thinking about, well, why would someone go this route? Well, if you're trying to get your protein from plants, you absolutely can do it through supplements. But I was even looking at today, I figured the first question you would ask me is, what do you eat for breakfast? And as a plant strongitarian, vegan more or less, people are asking me all the time, well, where do you get your protein? And yes, do I eat protein shakes? Absolutely. But just this morning for breakfast, I had over 30 grams of protein, all whole foods, and just eating oatmeal and hemp nuts and nut butters and different things. If you look at how much protein comes from plants, it's pretty impressive. And ultimately, where did the animals get their amino acids from? They're not producing amino acids only by themselves. They're getting it through the food they consume, which is found in plants. And I think that's the number one and probably most interesting thing to talk about is the protein concept. But really, when you start breaking it down, there's so much more macronutrients at play, and then even micronutrients that really matter in this whole nutrition paradox that we live in, and certainly navigating the fad diets. Oh, Nancy, you're on mute.
Oh, there it is. No, yeah, those are excellent points. Thank you for addressing those, Tyler. Because I think the other interesting piece for me was that when you did talk about breakfast, sounded very good. Did you toss a banana or some fruit in there, buddy?
Yeah, so I put an apple. So for breakfast today, I had oatmeal. So I do a little bit more than 1 serving. That's not quite enough for me. So two servings, and then I love peanut butter and almond butter. So 2 scoops of that. And then there's these things called hemp hearts. So part of if you eat plant-based and you're not eating fish, you can be a little low on your omega-3s. And there are plants that have it, but you have to incorporate those into your solution. So before everyone else was in the call, we were talking about Nancy's work and really building optimal meals to meet the diet requirements of athletes. And some of that really plays into it. So thinking through, where am I getting the different nutrition that I need is part of it. And, ultimately for me, I want food to taste good, be convenient, and the net effect is I want to feel good. I'm not an athlete anymore. I work out, but I largely want to feel good. And I want my food to be enjoyable and be convenient. And that's probably the biggest change of plant-based food today than in the past is people and chefs are embracing what's possible with plants. And then you have a plant-based experience that's like, wow, this is delicious, which really makes it more sustainable.
So I love that last statement, Tyler, about food, enjoying food. That's what it's meant to be. It's social, it's engaging, but also, it should taste good, and it's a whole foods approach, because that's also, as you know, and working with me at UConn, it was always, what can we do? Let's get it through the diet. Let's get it through food first. And then, you, for the audience, as a sports nutritionist and really as a nutritionist in general, you can't put blinders on and say no supplements. You've got to get it all from food. Everybody that's listening, we all have different behaviors and patterns and things like that. And I remember when we first started seeing some of our athletes at UConn that were interested in really being vegan. Some of them, it may have been gut issues relative to gluten or this or that, or protein, but other athletes were just making personal choices based on beliefs or how they wanted to navigate their meals. Is that some of the supplements at the time were not blends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, when you talk about hemp, like I had I think he was an offensive lineman. He ate quite a bit of oatmeal, and we spooned the peanut butter in and then slivered almonds and threw in a bunch of different things to get him up to 30 to 40 grams of protein, right? So, there are ways that you can do it. So I think there are 2 points here for you, Tyler, and then we might be ready to take questions. Time's gone fast. One is, the conversation that's specific to blends, because I remember, I had a gal that came in that was doing hemp protein, and we analyzed her whole diet as she made the shifts, and she was eating whole grains, really working from that, vegan perspective, but the strength coach sent her to me to make sure the protein was coming in. Mm-hmm. And the hemp was just a little insufficient with some of those essentials. And eventually we navigated and found our way to Vega, and now they've got a sports line, but maybe sharing with the audience what we mean sometimes with these blends.
Yeah.
And then also just the whole fact of whole foods,
So all plant-based proteins and plant-based supplements, for that matter, are not the same. So you definitely have to look into what are the amino acid makeup. And the rule of thumb that works best for me is legumes are the most balanced and most proficient amino acids from plants. So legumes are soybeans. So what's the soybean if you don't want to eat a supplement? Edamame, tofu, tempeh, all soybeans. And then peas. So peas are a legume as well. So are chickpeas, lentils, fava beans, all of those dry seeded soup beans. They're all great sources of plant-based protein. Purists, we use pea protein as our main source. And the reason being is we look at it as ultimately protein quality and amino acid density, but how can we scale this from a farmer's perspective? Like, who will grow enough of these to matter? And pea protein was that for us. And I think on the blended side, you're absolutely right. Probably early 2000s, soy protein was really the only protein around, and it's a quality protein. It has some pros to it, but there's some cons. If you Google soy protein, it's not very, very Google friendly, is what I like to say. And well, why is that? Well, some people have some allergens to it, allergen response to it. Some people do not like the fact that most soybeans are genetically modified. Other people, there's been studies that link it to different hormonal things. And so it's not that Google friendly. So when we looked at it, is we needed a fresh approach to plant-based, something that didn't have all the baggage, and we could start building from a clean slate and building new foods from that. And really why we chose peas. And I see Paul sent this question over, and I would like to address it. He asked if only 5% is vegans and vegetarians, and why are so many companies advertising to those people? And honestly, I believe that it's mostly due to understanding of what's in the food. There's so many companies today, and I call it like NASCAR, where the food package looks like a NASCAR vehicle with certified this, certified that, non-GMO, organic, gluten-free, this or that. And it's very hard to navigate from a buyer's perspective. And so anything that is simple, that meets these requirements, you can meet the vegan standard and then any other standard really from that point. So I think that's why they're advertising. But any big food company like Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, they will tell you the majority of their customers are also buying some form of animal protein too. And maybe not completely, maybe in majority, but too, and also. So I think to me that's why they're advertising it, Paul. But ultimately, I believe the upside is the flexitarian.
Yeah, one of the points I'll add to that, as someone who has who's persistent in trying to acquire funding, is that the paper that I shared with you, for example, Tyler, and with the group, when we wrote a additional proposal to really move some of these plant-based meal patterns into the context of research to look at muscle fiber type muscle strength and things like that. And that's not really what's of interest to this conversation. What was of interest was that particular number, 5% or 10%, that one of the reviewers actually said, why in the world would we invest this kind of money? And why would we do this? Vegan, plant forward, it's a fad. You and I had that conversation. For me, it's learning about it as a nutritionist. Your whole foods, you're looking at different things. And my goal is to keep people healthy and to figure out ways to eat and accomplish that. And if we find this middle of the road, and I'm going to use that to segue before we open up to questions. I know we're right on the edge at 4:35, but I didn't want to move away from, since we've got agriculture, all UConn alums here, is when you talked about peas, why peas? Remember I mentioned to you something about being, I sort of disclosed, I've been involved with WHEY, these different groups, but that there was a conversation regarding the environment and what was environmentally friendly. And so when they talk about whey protein, I often think when you open up your yogurt, whether it's Dannon, whether it's Chobani, there's always a little bit of liquid that's kind of on the top, which is characterized as the whey, right? A little bit of that moves through. Or cheese, those are byproducts. So they go, well, that's a natural byproduct. To get to some of these plant proteins, you're using all these organics. And I remembered you shared with me that's not how we process our peas. And I found that interesting because there is this, I don't know if it's so subtle a debate or not, between how do we decrease greenhouse gases? What role does agriculture play in terms of our current environmental crisis? So from where you...
Nancy, this topic is, we could have a whole webinar on this, probably a whole week-long one. There's so much to unpack, but ultimately, when you look at animal versus plant, one, the plants or the animals are eating plants. So how those plants were raised starts really what is built up from that food. And so let's talk about that for a second. So one of the questions I saw up there was, are Purist's peas GMO, genetically modified? So we start with non-genetically modified peas. All peas are non-GMO, and we actually grow a lot of them organically. And what does organic mean? Well, organic means you cannot use insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, effectively chemicals, synthetic chemicals, to kill off those things, plants, insects, etc. And we look at it as, how can we build the most clean and the lack of any chemical residue in our products as possible? Because as we go further downstream, we need to build that cleanliness into our product. That's why we're called purists, pure is. And ultimately, the way we make pea protein is through using water. And we separate different densities of starches and fibers. And then we use a pH adjustment, which creates, similar to cheese, it creates a coagulating effect where we can concentrate the protein and then ultimately sell a pure form of protein. So sounds like, and our plants are large, they take energy. But when you look at the net impact as it relates to sustainability and really regenerative practices in our food system, you can, a simple Google will show you some information related to plant-based meat, where it's 90% less greenhouse gas emissions, 93% less water, around 40% less energy. And the net effect is that it's just more efficient. And what Purist is doing, we're growing peas that yield more for farmers. So they have more volume per acre and have higher protein. So us compared to the industry, we can actually produce about twice as many of those plant-based burgers on 1 acre of our land than our competition can. So we're looking at how can we just be more resourceful and ultimately use less resources while we're making the food to feed people. And we're choosing through plants, and a lot of people are finding new ways to do that through other sorts of agriculture, including animal. we're leaning towards a more regenerative way so it can support the future and our kids' kids, so to say.
Yeah, so we keep agriculture. We're just talking about ways to maximize what we're going to get from it in terms of what people eat.
I think it's maximizing what you can get, but it's also what you put back. So the key reason why rice and peas are paired from an agricultural side, there's also corn in that equation. Well, corn, wheat, oats, they're all nitrogen needing plants.
Yes.
So you plant a rotational crop with them that fixates nitrogen, so it takes nitrogen from the air, converts it with bacteria in the soil to a usable nitrogen for the plant. And they overproduce it, so there's extra fertilizer for the corn or oats, wheat, hemp. So you need less synthetic nitrogen. The synthetic nitrogen issue in our the way we farm globally is a huge problem. Lots of chemicals are applied and then end up in the rivers.
People get upset
exactly.
about.
And so having rotation and having biodiversity creates soil health, which reduces the amount of chemicals. Plant-based food plays a big role in that, and so does some other practices as well. And what I like is that people are just more conscious, because plant-based eating, yes, looking at it just from a human perspective, can I survive off of a plant-based diet? Yep. Can I live optimally? Yep. Can I perform well as an athlete? Yep. Okay, great. But what else can it do? Well, it's this consciousness of planet and other species that we share this planet with, including animals and wildlife, et cetera. And I think that to me wasn't my primary reason when I got into this business, but certainly becomes more important to me as I go and really get connected to where our food comes from, how it's grown, why it's grown, and ultimately its net effect on the world.
Yeah. So yes or no? And then I see a couple of former colleagues and I'll lead off with her question since but is that the second point I was going to make earlier when you were talking about breakfast and things is that you have some knowledge and some background. From my perspective as a practitioner, I think that those meal patterns and things that, we've shared, that there's a lot of education that is needed, because in reality, it's been my experience that for an athlete to eat well and to perform when they're the majority plant-based, all right, some of them may or may not eat red meat, some of them may eat eggs and drink milk, there's going to be this sort of hybrid of people or athletes, young, old, navigating life, but some of them really don't know how to approach it so that, yes, you can optimize muscle recovery, or you can optimize, growth and development. So I think we're not going to answer that question today, but would you agree we're still sort of at this impasse to figure out how do we kind of use this information to develop, I don't even want to think of it as PR. It's really more of just getting it right for the masses.
Nancy, I think the more we learn about stuff, the more we realize we don't know very much. And if we can we've invested so much money and understanding and call it the old way that everyone ate, animal foods. And there's not been as much of an investment, in specifically in the United States, to that same cause. And I personally think that, economics drives policy, not vice versa. So if you can create a business and create the demand and people want it, then folks will start creating businesses and then start funding studies. And it's a process that takes a while. And so I have spent very little time going to Capitol Hill and trying to get anything. But really spent a ton of time creating a business so we can partner with places like UConn and start leaning in where there's gaps in knowledge and start filling those gaps with well-equipped people that can understand, so you can share the information, good or bad, but share it so people can understand that there's other options out there. And if they want to go this route, here's some resources that they can leverage.
Beautiful. That's great. Thank you, Tyler. I'm going to, just because I've been looking at this one question, Marie Cantino, she's feels that she's plant forward. She eats meat once every, week or two and likes the pea protein, but it can be costly and maybe for a lot of people, out of reach. So what do you see for the industry in terms of availability and economic drive?
Yeah, wow, she's nailing it. This is my pitch to every bank and investor out there. You look at, to give you a sense, everyone probably on this call has at least had or tried a plant-based milk. There's about 41% household penetration in plant-based milks, and it's a $1.8 billion industry. It represents around 20% of all fluid milk sales in the United States. Plant-based meat is about 1% of the sales of animal meat in the United States, which is a $90 billion industry and has 14% household penetration. So if plant-based meat can get as big as animal-based meat, that will really drive the most important things in terms of economics, which is scale. And it's just so that plant-based is so in its nascent phase and growing that as scale becomes on our side, we'll start producing things for better prices. I could tell you Purus is leading the charge on this. We've invested over $100 million that we've had to sell our company to get. It's not like we had it. But so everyone gets excited when you raise money. I'm like, we're selling our company. This is terrible. But we're investing in that. So we work with over 400 farmers in 14 different states across the US. By the end of next year, it'll be 800 farmers, and just grow. And that will bring the cost down some. And affordable and accessible is the #1 challenge for plant-based food. And at scale, it'll be cheaper than animal-based, for sure.
Great. I see a question from Sally. Can you talk about using plant protein for weight loss? Any good books, websites, or topics? We should just have your information. I'm happy to email you a couple of websites and to talk about it. I think that there are, different meal plans and patterns that would focus more on plant protein if that's where you're headed. For middle-aged and older women, that has been one of my areas of interest, is how do you look at these plant-based eating patterns that the dietary guidelines recommend, that they put into place. And, the unfortunate thing is as we get older, we just typically require fewer calories. And the only way to offset that is to be active. And so it is important. I found in private practice, when I am working with individuals, especially women, as they get older and they're interested in losing weight, they may not want to give up their glass of wine at dinner. They may not, but the easiest way, but it's not that convenient for all of us, is to find a way to expend more calories. And so plant protein can help, because if you consume the fiber, it can fill you up. Maybe you'll eat less, but you also want to eat the plant protein in the context of the diet, as Tyler alluded to earlier, to get the protein that you need. And it is possible to do so. I would need to send you, I think, a website or a couple of different how-to kinds of ways of looking at your diet so that you can individualize it and then make it work for you. Let's see. Tyler, do you see one there?
Oh, Andy put one that's pretty interesting.
Okay.
He said that not all plants are created equal. And it sounds like he stole this from my talk track. And he says, coming from Iowa, you know better than most that issues of GMO plants, pesticide residues, and you mentioned eating oatmeal for breakfast. There's been a lot of news lately about glyphosate residue in oats, even organically grown oats. Can you comment? So there's more to it, but that is a great question. So actually, why is there so what is glyphosate? It's probably a better question to start. Glyphosate is Roundup. Roundup, we've all probably seen it in Menards or Home Depot or whatever. You use it to kill weeds. It's really was the driver to some of the agrochemical. It's the #1 used agricultural chemical in the world. And you have to genetically modify the seeds so the plants are resistant to this Roundup and glyphosate. Well, oats, wheat, peas, different legumes, they are not all resistant, but some farmers use glyphosate as an off-label reason. It's called a desiccant. So when peas or oats or wheat are about to harvest, some farmers, which may I say, you cannot do this if you grow for purists, and we're actually certified detox free, which means we're glyphosate free in all of our products. But farmers use glyphosate as a desiccant, which will burn down the plants and basically get them to mature faster so they can harvest them. And yes, Andy, you're right. This does show up in trace amounts. So when you're looking for some of these plants, one, you can look for that certification, glyphosate free, which is a new and up and coming certification, or you can just look for organic. To Andy's point, at times that it is found in organic products, usually due to either agricultural cross-contamination or some sort of contamination in the water or the soil, but largely that's not the case. And for us, we think we need to build more traceability, more certainty that there's no chemical residue in any of our ingredients. And we go to all the way back to the farm to teach and coach our farmers to use alternative practices than effectively chemicals to get the job done. Great question though, and that's a major problem in industry right now.
Yeah, and you know what, and I'm going to, Andy, just hit something quickly for the second part of your question, and that is, I'm a very big proponent of farm to fork, of buying local, eating local, you know, growing your own. If you can have a garden, that's wonderful. You know, taking advantage, because I also think that when people are talking about a carbon footprint and worried about the environment, that when there are these organic practices and there are things that are local, you know, nothing is getting on a refrigerated truck and being shipped, and nothing, you know, and it also helps the local economy, and those are fresher, it's just fresher food. It isn't as easy as I thought it had been. This farm to fork initiative has been going on now for almost a decade, and it's a big push. It's hard because we still see local farmers and places that go under, but yeah. Someone asked here, Tyler, about the difference between the GMO process and the process you guys use for your seeds. And I'm not
so GMO, non-GMO typically is talking about the difference between seeds. There are some ingredients or processing aids that certain companies choose to use that are deemed from a genetically modified source. There's a butterfly that you can see on products called non-GMO Project Certified, and they're a third-party independent certification company that has a standard that companies that have that butterfly have to live under. So what's the difference between what Purist does and GMO seeds? Well, GMO is an acronym for genetically modified organism. And really the gist of it is where you can take one species and that same species and make an improvement of that species, or you can take one species and a separate species, a different one, and create a new altogether species. That's what genetic modification is. So they're literally changing a gene with a different plant. And the goal, or bacteria, there's different ways to do it, but the goal really back in the 90s was to create a resistance to chemical inputs. And still today, there's a number of other new technologies called CRISPR, which is gene editing, largely used in human clinical work, like organ growing and things like that. But it's finding its way into plant-based. Very interesting space. Some of the biggest of the bigs play in that space. And it's really created the movement for people to understand, again, back to Andy's point, where your food comes from, how it's made, who are you ultimately supporting. And we love to say the same thing as you, Nancy, farm to fork or shop local as you can. And not only because the food's probably better, but you're supporting people in your community.
Yes. All right, well, let's scroll down. Yes, you know, Andy, I wish I could require my students to read their textbook. But yes, I think the omnivore dilemma, maybe that would be good reading. I'm trying to think of another one that I have here that my son had read.
Are we talking books?
About books that relate, you know, it's just the way that people eat and getting people to understand. My current challenge, are you familiar Tyler, you've heard about the Lancet diet from Harvard. Have you seen some of that information, which, you know, it's clearly a well-written document. I mean, it's led by Walter Willett, someone who's done a tremendous amount of epidemiological work focused on eating healthy, trying to eat to avoid chronic diseases and cancer. But it sort of tells this nice story, and then it makes that leap of faith to an improved environment, which I was glad to hear you say we're not quite there yet. I think everybody's trying to do their part, and probably when they're able to better harmonize and there aren't these competitive issues at play, maybe we'll be a little bit more successful.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Pinu, do you absorb plant-based protein the same as animal-based protein? Which one? You know, Pin, whether plant-based protein or animal-based protein is more available. That's been out there for a while. I think that Tyler even alluded to the fact that soy, which was characterized as a very high quality plant protein for so long, sort of got beat up a little bit because it's more slowly digested and the amino acids get into the system a little bit slower. For plant protein or other protein from your pasta, protein from your whole grain bread, well, you are digesting it. You do have to break it down and get it in, but those are some of those other kinds of components that come with it. With whole nuts and cereals and grains, you get your omega-3s, you get your vitamin E. When you get your whole grains, you're getting iron. You know, they're not necessarily the same form, but it's a balance. It's a dance that we're trying to learn how to do to make sure there aren't these nutritional deficiencies and challenges. I don't want to get on my soapbox, but one of my current, you know, it's not really a pet peeve. I'm confused by the amount of money that is being invested to look at something that we call the PDCAS, which is digestibility of amino acids when you eat protein and what you digest, protein digestibility. And now there's a new one called DIAS, which is digestibility. And the differences are literally in the animal model that does the DIAS, they just take the sample before the animal poops it out, for lack of a better term. And the difference in these two values are so subtle that as someone who likes food and as a practitioner and knows how people really eat, because I can design the perfect diet for myself, that doesn't mean I'm going to always eat it. So, you know, some of these issues that sort of come into play as people look at them, again, in the total context of the diet and how you eat, I believe we overcome a lot of that. But the studies and the research that's out there right now that compares animal to plant, and I eat animal protein, but I'm just saying what I've learned is that you really just can't compare peas to an apple to a piece of steak. We're looking, and I think what Purist has also been striving to do, which I think is one of the reasons we thought this would be a good presentation in the context of the plant-based series, is figuring out how you integrate these things into foods or into healthy lifestyles, or to assist countries where good nutrition is elusive and you're trying to figure out what are ways that we can optimize growth and development in a number of places, not just in Hartford or Des Moines, something like that. So we're running close to the end of our time. I'm really thrilled for the folks that were here. I'm hoping that, you know, you walked away with some points, and I know that we'll hold on to the questions. And is that right, Maggie? You can chat me just to be sure. Usually what we'll try to do is the ones that are specific to Tyler will go his way and mine, and we'll try to assemble those answers for you. Tyler, do you have any closing remarks or comments for the group?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Nancy, for letting me share the stage with you, so to say. You know, obviously I look up to you and always will. And this was fun. This just reminds me of any old conversation we always have. So normally maybe we argue a little bit more because it make it a little bit more entertaining. But this is great, and it was a lot of fun. I'm going to send two things over to the panelists so they can, or excuse me, to the audience so everyone can see. But one is a 21-day Kickstart vegan meal plan that is super simple and easy and free, which is always good, that you can check out. And then also, you know, a shameless plug to Tom Brady's protein shakes. If you guys want to eat the best protein powder out there that's vegan, that is all purist, do this one. It's super tasty and an easy step from an animal version to a plant version. So I'll leave you with that. And I guess my hope is people don't only embrace plants because it's cool and in the news all the time. They embrace plants because it's great for nutrition, it's great for the planet, and it's also great for the animals, which we didn't touch on much. But I do think all three of those, if it can taste just as good or better, why not?
All right. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, everyone. It was great. I appreciate it. Thank you.